Welcome everybody to the first GHP brown bag talk of the spring semester. Might not feel like spring yet, but here we are. We're very pleased today to have Dr. Vincenzo Bollettino here. He's the director of the Resilient Communities Program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Previously, he was executive director of HHI, and he's also a senior research scientist in Department of Global Health and Population. So we're very pleased to have him here, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. So as you mentioned, I'm Enzo Bollettino. I've been with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative for nearly 15 years now, since 2008, so for quite some time. And I've been doing research primarily for the past 8 years on disaster preparedness and resilience. Much of that work is focused on the Philippines, which I'll talk about today, but we've done some work in Bangladesh as well, and we're beginning to do some programs in Nepal. I noticed that one of my colleagues who's a co-PI with me, Dr. Patrick Bink, is also on the line, so we're happy to have him with us as well. So I'm going to talk to you today about the findings from a 2017 nationwide survey that we did in the Philippines. This was a household level survey, just over 5,200 respondents, looking at and contrasting regional level results for levels of preparedness for disaster based on household level data. I'm very pleased that we have the opportunity to repeat this. So we are doing another household level survey now in the coming month. So nearly 7 years since we did the previous one. And there's been some really interesting developments since then. We've had COVID, and we have a very different administration in the Philippines with Duterte for our previous survey happened before Duterte. So both the political dynamics and the dynamics related to COVID have, I expect, resulted in some significant changes, and we'll see what those are. But the interesting thing is that we'll be able to compare results between 2017 and now, which I'm very excited about. Just to put things in context in terms of looking at preparedness and resilience in the Philippines, the Philippines is a country that is enormously impacted by natural hazards. Not just climate, they have all kinds of volcanic activity, lots of seismic activity in this very, sorry, I'm walking away from the podium, in this southern region in Mindanao. They have nearly 1 or 2 small earthquakes a month. So it's constantly active, and lots of volcanic activity and landslides as well. But in addition to this, and especially the thing that they're predominantly impacted by are climate-related events. So typhoons are probably the most significant, not probably, they are the most significant natural hazard in the Philippines. And these are enormously affected by climate change. You've seen, you may have seen in recent media discussions about the hurricane rating system not being adequate to account for the severity of hurricanes now, and they're thinking about adding a category 6 hurricane. Well, typhoons, which are basically hurricanes in the Asia region, can be enormous. And typhoons come into what is called the Philippines area of responsibility anywhere between 20 and 25 times a year. And 4 or 5 of those are major and make landfall. So this is a really significant threat to the Philippines. And of course, what comes with typhoons is all kinds of flooding, and that leads to other kinds of additional impacts on populations, especially living in low-lying urban areas or coastal communities. So this is a really big deal. And I just mentioned this discussion about category 6 hurricanes. Well, in 2013, the Philippines was hit by what was called locally Typhoon Yolanda and internationally Typhoon Haiyan. And this really reshaped thinking about what climate change was going to mean for the Philippines. And they began to rethink not only how they categorize the impact of these events, but how they prepare for warn the population, what kinds of systems need to be put into place in order to reduce the impacts of those typhoons, which invariably are going to be potentially more frequent, more severe, and changing in tracks, so affecting places that may not traditionally have been affected, like in the south of the Philippines, that was more traditionally free from typhoon activity, and increasing the typhoon tracks are changing, and so now places that were not impacted previously are now beginning to be impacted, and this is where they just simply don't have the level of preparation that other areas in the country do. So the Philippines, just to summarize, is a place that is enormously impacted by climate-related events, typhoons and flooding especially, drought as well. And as you can see, it's entirely comprised of islands, more than 7,000 in total, 2,000 of which are inhabited. So obviously, coastal flooding, sea level rise, it impacts the Philippines in a much greater way than it does many other large nation states. And the Philippines is a fairly large nation state with over 115 million people now. Let's take a look at the different kinds of work that we do. Now, I'm going to be talking today about this house level survey that we did across the country and that we're repeating now this year. But we also do more participatory action level research themselves, where we'll go into a community and try to work with members of the community to identify the sorts of issues that are relevant to them and try to identify research-related projects that might help them to think of ways to address some of the challenges that they face. We've also done network analyses to look at the interconnectivity and connections, or the kind of ecological system of organizations that are responsible for preparedness and response in the Philippines, wanting to understand how are local organizations preparing and responding, how are they connected to one another, what role do international organizations play, what is the connectivity like between international and national organizations, and what happens if you pull out so how do you characterize those relationships, and what happens if you pull out certain relationships like international organizations, how does that affect the way things look in terms of national level connectivity? So it's a sort of another level of research that we've done. And then I would say with all three levels of this kind of research, we really try to make an effort. And here's where, it's really hard to assess impact. You can measure like publications and things like this, but how do you know just how many people are really taking into account the data that you're producing and utilizing that data to either inform policy or programming? It's difficult to do on a systematic basis. We have lots of anecdotal information, and one thing we make a real effort to do is to publicize what we're doing at a national level through national media. And we've been extremely fortunate to have a very talented former journalist on our team who has incredible communication skills and has been able to translate a lot of our research into public-facing information, which has garnered a lot of attention and public awareness raising, which is one of our primary objectives and goals. So we've been fortunate to have that. All right, so going back to look at our nationwide survey and thinking about the different dimensions of resilience that we looked at. One of them was around information and trying to understand what kinds of information people have access to, what kinds of information they trust, what they actually utilize in their own preparation for responding to and preparing for disasters. We asked questions about their previous experience with disasters, wanting to know if there's a connection between what they've experienced in the past and what they are doing now or planning to do in the future to prepare for disasters. We've looked at things like health measures. We've looked at livelihoods. So wanting to look at some of the standard measures of like what is the link between people's access to resources, people's access to health, and their ability to prepare for disaster. We've looked at security factors. These are not evenly distributed, as all of these factors are not evenly distributed across the country, but the southern part of the Philippines in particular has more challenges around security than other parts of the country for a whole variety of reasons, which I won't go into right now, but I'm happy to discuss in conversations. We looked at governance and the role of especially local government units. And local government units are really play a primary role in disaster preparedness and response in the Philippines. And they really vary in terms of not only their resources, but whether or not they are appointing people with disaster experience and background to positions of authority, or whether they are appointing people that are just they're political appointees but may not have the requisite skill set. So local governance really matters a lot in terms of a community's ability to prepare effectively for disaster. And then finally, we looked at people's engagement with the community itself, measured by their participation in organizations and their connectivity or participation in sort of group level activities within the community to see whether there was any connection between that and their overall preparedness for disaster. So those are some of the dimensions that we included in the survey. And then I'll say just a note about how that survey was created. As is typical, we did a review of the literature to look at what previous research had been done in the Philippines and elsewhere in Southeast Asia on disaster preparedness and resilience. And then we took existing sort of measures and included those in our survey instrument. But I think more importantly, what we did was to gather key stakeholders that are responsible for preparedness, responsible for disaster response in the Philippines. So we gathered together local government actors, we gathered together private sector actors, and the private sector plays a big role in the Philippines in preparedness and response, unlike many other places, or much more than other places. Military, which also plays a primary role in response, community-based organizations, and other disaster management level officials. And we gathered everyone together into basically a workshop where we asked each of them to identify all of the information, imagine themselves as having to prepare for an incoming typhoon, and ask them what are all the things that you need to do in preparation. What kinds of information would you need? From whom would you expect? Would you need it? Who would you expect to provide services to you? And then along those dimensions, we asked different questions of that group. Then we asked them, and we collected all of that information, all those questions. Then we asked them to imagine if they were a disaster professional, to imagine themselves in the position of being a community member, and knowing what they can provide as a professional, what would they expect as a community member to, what would they want to ask of those professionals, knowing what kinds of information, data, and systems that they have. And then we collected all of that information, worked together and workshopped different categories that fit into these different dimensions of resilience, and came up with a draft instrument. We then piloted this instrument to make sure, first of all, that we translated into 5 different Filipino languages and back translated. Then we piloted the instrument and then did data collection across the country using a team of different data collectors from a political polling organization that had a tremendous amount of experience in doing data collection across the country, and made it much easier for us to gain access in a nationwide way, and in a much more in a much speedier way than it would have been if we had to hire and train enumerators to do the data collection. So what are some of the things that we found? Not surprisingly, cyclones, typhoons are have a major impact in the Philippines. But virtually everyone has experienced some kind of significant natural hazard in the Philippines, whether it's flooding, whether it's typhoon related drought. It's simply, it is kind of a part of the fabric of Philippine society, so it's very significant. But we also asked questions about, I wanted to understand what is this sort of relationship between people's understanding of climate change, or their perspectives on climate change, and whether or not they would actually engage in activities, or were concerned enough about climate change to engage in preparedness activities. One thing that we found is that nearly 60% of Filipinos reported having very little knowledge of climate change, which for a place that is so dramatically impacted by climate-related events seemed a little surprising. And this is one of the things that I'm really curious to see how that's changed over the past 7 years. Bless you. The other thing that I'll mention is that there is a tremendous diversity, probably not surprising, but there's the resources available and the level of knowledge available and the experiences of Filipinos vary tremendously by region. So whereas nearly 40%, which is still low, of the country expressed knowledge of climate change at a national level in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, which is the southernmost portion where there's also some ongoing conflict, only 3.7% of people mentioned any kind of familiarity with climate change, which is a big difference and a serious issue. We asked people, what are the sorts of things that are impacted when a disaster happens, and far and away, for the most part, and probably not surprisingly, because we're doing a household level survey, what people were concerned with in their experience was damage to their own homes and to assets if they were in an agricultural community, to livelihoods, crops, and the like. But there was also damage to things like health facilities and school, although those were much, much lower. So predominantly what people are concerned with is the impact on their own homes and their livelihoods. Now here's where things get really interesting, and I'm very curious to see how they've sort of developed over time. So we asked people whose role did they feel that it was to respond to a disaster if a disaster were to happen. And far and away, the vast majority of people felt like it was local government units. It was the local government's responsibility to respond, with an expectation that the national government would respond if necessary, family members, but very few people cited community-based organizations or other civil society-based organizations, non-governmental organizations. Very few people cited them as having a responsibility. They really felt that it was the local government's responsibility to respond. Similar numbers for those respondents who were asked about preparation for future disasters. Local government, national level government, but not a whole lot, very little actually expected civil society organizations to play a role here. However, when we asked when an actual disaster happens, who actually delivers those services? Now suddenly, where these figures were 2, 3, 4%, now a quarter or more of the people are saying it's actually civil society-based organizations and NGOs that are providing services, even though they didn't have an expectation that they should be. And far fewer experienced local government or national government providing services, far more cited their own family members providing immediate aid. So this is significant if you're a local government unit or a national government thinking about awareness raising, education, and policy, because if people's expectations don't align with their actual experience, then there's a problem. There's a complete mismatch there. And that it varies significantly, not only, and these are national level figures, but it can vary quite a lot by region as well. So we measured preparedness, what people actually did to prepare for disaster across 3 sets of activities. And in each one of these activities, we had a whole series of sub-measures. So each of these included training. So what people did to engage in actual training activities for disasters, whether that's some form of response or preparedness. Their engagement in planning, and that could have been planning at a community level or within their own family. And then the third was around investments in actual tangible things. And that could have been anything from putting together a go bag that included medications, money, storing water, storing food, digitizing documents. So anything, strengthening a house, any kind of actual concrete activity that they took to better withstand the impact of a future disaster. So we measured preparedness across these 3 dimensions. But what's interesting here is how different levels of preparedness are across different regions. So again, looking at this top level, looking at training, nearly just over a quarter of the people in the country participated in some form of training, which is quite a lot. but only 3% of people in the Bronx-Aurora region identified as having participated in any form of training, whereas almost 42% in the national capital region engaged in supported training. That's a huge gap in training activities. The same thing is true for planning, and the same thing is true for material investments. And the question is why? The question is this just a matter of resources that are available? Is it a question of education? Is it a question of policy and awareness raising? Is it a question of local government resources? And it's difficult to discern the answers to that from the survey. It points to the actual gap, but not what accounts for that gap. And to get to those answers really requires going back to communities, going back to local governments and presenting them with the data and then discussing those findings and trying to understand why the findings are why the data say what to do. And that's something that we do. So we'll go back and when we do have the data, we'll present in academic fora, we'll set up workshops, we'll invite in we'll do private sector presentations. We do presentations to local government units, to the network of mayors. We try to engage every level and fabric of the society that is involved in any kind of preparedness or response measures. So what are some of the key takeaways? One is that general knowledge of climate change is pretty low, and that's an issue. Another thing that I didn't mention was that there's an interesting connection between a person's perception of whether climate-related events would impact them and their proclivity to engage in preparedness measures. So people that believe that they would be impacted by climate change took more proactive measures to prepare for future disasters than those that did not. Can't tell you exactly why or what the causal pathway is there, but there's certainly a statistical correlation there. People's expectations about who's going to provide services is very different from who they actually receive services from when a disaster happens, which is an issue for policy and something that needs to be addressed. And will be interesting to see whether those gaps persist when we do the data collection now as compared to 2017. Another is that only a third of Filipinos are undertaking proactive measures to prepare for disasters. And then another interesting finding, and here I'm really pleased that we are, since 2017, there have been far more measures of the connection between mental health and disasters. So now there are a number of different validated studies linking things like eco-anxiety, climate anxiety, and there are scales that have been developed and validated that we now included, that we didn't have access to in 2017, but we included in the survey instrument this time around. And one of the things that we did find, because we did ask questions about mental health, was that there was a strong connection between a sense of self-efficacy and actual preparedness activity. So people felt that they had agency. They actually did. It translated into them taking concrete steps or actions to prepare for future disasters. Then finally, I'll just end with there's always a lot of debate around what does disaster resilience really mean. There's a number of different ways of measuring resilience, but some of the things that we found compelling from the data in our own survey were that self-reported measures of preparedness and self-reported measures of resilience were highly correlated with things like access to quality services, being able to rely on social support, especially from within communities. And there's a really interesting cultural expression of community support in the Philippines called Bayanihan, which is represented in art and other things, but literally by the community coming together and making up a house and moving in. So there's a strong sense of communal help that's expressed in different ways within Philippine society. The other is that people actually take, those people that take active measures to engage in training or planning investments express much higher levels of resilience. And then finally is this link between mental health and resilience, which I'm hoping we can delve into in even greater detail than we have in the past, because there are now instruments and scales that are available to look at things like ecological, environmental anxiety and climate-related anxiety. So I'll stop with that and then turn it to you for any conversation, questions about the Philippines, about disaster preparedness, and the work that we've done and plan to do, online as well as here. Thank you. Yes.
So, great job. I can't wait to see the results of the new one. Good question. So that number in that particular area, that only 3.7%.
Yes, yeah.
That's mind blowing. So did you add a question about why people think those disasters are happening, what kind of connection they make? And if you asked,
Yes.
what those people think are the reasons for the disasters? And if you didn't ask, can you add this in the new one?
Yeah, no, we did ask that.
So why they think the disasters are happening?
Yeah, so there's a variety of different reasons. What's really interesting is what they think will be the result. So sometimes it's an act of God. So people will think that, this is just in God's hands. Other people will relate it to, they have an understanding of climate change and say, well, the temperatures are rising, that's leading to shifts in weather patterns, we're starting to witness drought. There's a variety of different perspectives on the question of why. What's really interesting is their perception of what the impact of those changes is, and what. So there are things that you would expect, like an observation of rising temperatures, but the one that came out to be the strongest was disease, and that what they said was basically that the result of these changes is an increase in disease. That was the greatest sort of fear, was related to health and disease.
Okay, so there's a lot of room for doing some patient campaign, because if you believe it's God or whatever,
Yeah.
then there's nothing to do, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, but it really varies a lot. And what's it's really fascinating is the southern part of the country, because it's so agriculturally rich. It's basically the breadbasket of the Philippines. So all of the agricultural production, or a lot of the agricultural production, is coming from the south. But it's also the place where you have the most marginalized indigenous populations. You have a real there's a tension between Christian and more Islamic communities. You have all of these different religious, ethnic, and even communist movements going on. So you have a variety of different non-state armed groups that have different objectives that complicate these factors. And they're now, so in addition to having all of sort of these social and conflict-related issues, you now have the impacts of climate in ways that weren't there before. And one of the biggest challenges is getting the professional communities. So not just looking at how people are receiving this and being impacted and the connection with like forced migration, but even the professional communities that deal with peace building on one hand, or climate adaptation and development on the other hand. Those aren't communities that typically speak to one another or work together, but now you have both of this confluence of factors affecting the same communities. And so there's a need to coordinate and have an understanding amongst different kinds of professional activities that are happening from national and national level actors. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. That's a great presentation. So I have two questions. One is, within the household survey, are you able to look at trends to see if there are differences by gender or by age group. So for example, there are a lot of studies now looking at adolescence and heightened stress related to climate change. And the second question is just more generally in the country, are there programs working with educators around sort of climate change curriculums for young children, adolescents in schools that might be making a difference?
Yeah, so on the first, yes, there's so much data that we have that I didn't present here in this presentation. I just gave you a kind of sample of some of the findings that I found interesting, but you may find completely different things interesting. And of course, we put out reports and papers on all of this data. I'm happy to share those with all of you. And well, interestingly, in the Philippines, and people are always skeptical of this, but honestly, in the Philippines, the gender component of it is not as pronounced as I've seen in other areas. And that's not to say, I'm not saying that it doesn't play, it's not a factor. It's just not as clear as it is, for example, and we haven't just begun to study Nepal, but there it's really evident that it is playing a major role. In the Philippines, it's not that it's insignificant, it just isn't as much of a factor as other things like wealth and access to education, and at least in the data that we collected, which is basically self-reported, self-perception data. In terms of education, it varies a lot. It really depends on the region, the level of commitment, and level of resources that the local government units have. But generally speaking, there's a significant push to include education on climate, on disasters in education, in curriculum for education at multiple levels. Interestingly, there, and this is not coming out of the survey, but other sort of community-based research that we've done. One of the things that and I can't generalize about this because this is really community specific, but there's this real trade-off between communities having to decide in places that are really impacted between moving and going to another place entirely versus trying to stay and adapt to constant flooding and all of the sort of issues that are associated with that flooding, disease, and things, impacts on livelihoods. And it's a really difficult decision for communities. There's no clear, there are costs and benefits to each. So for example, we worked with one community that left because many people had died in the flood, and so they moved the community away from this low-lying level area. But that resulted in kind of social fracture because they were now further away from sources of livelihood. So often what happened is the men would leave to go look for work elsewhere, and that then women were left in the communities with not as much access to education for their children as they had previously. So there's so many factors that can try to figure out what to do at a kind of community level when you're facing serious levels of exposure. But in terms of education, yes, there are definitely lots of efforts, but it varies. Like I showed with some of the data on preparedness levels, it varies a lot by where you are and the resources you have access to as a local government.
Thank you.
Yes.
This is very interesting. Thank you for sharing. I also have a couple of questions related though. So one is, do you have any measure of how much people were exposed to social welfare programs? I know Philippines has great cash transfer program. They just launched a food stamp program.
Yeah.
And climate change affects poor people disproportionately.
Yeah.
And related to that, whether you can see whether their perception change, especially on expectation of what the government would do, kind of central government versus local government.
Yeah.
The second question related to that is how much are those perceptions due to the fact that people have the right expectation, so the local government should do something, but maybe they don't have the resources to do it,
yeah.
And someone else is responding versus how much the local government completely does not have the resources? Like, are the perception wrong,
Yeah.
basically?
So for the first question,
Yeah.
the answer is no, not in an adequate way. So we didn't
Okay.
measure, so we didn't have, or we didn't ask questions or have data on the variety of different social programs that may have been, might exist. It was more generally around social support and whether they could expect to receive services from the local government or whether they were parts of an organization engaged in community level activities. We did have measures of wealth, like household level wealth. We did ask questions about insurance, and there's very low levels of insurance. The highest levels of insurance were health, but even with health, it was fairly low. But if you looked at things like asset insurance or property insurance, it was negligible. So that's a great question. We don't have adequate data for saying anything definitive about that. The second question is that it's hard. We didn't have like a baseline measure of local government unit activities and resources. So what we're looking at is perception data from community members and the households within those communities. But I can't answer that question because I don't know how those perceptions would link to the actual number of resources that those local government units had. What I can say anecdotally is that some local governments really make a point of professionalizing and providing career opportunities for people that have an education and background in preparedness and response, and investing in that. And that has a broader, and then that leads to, for example, programs within local universities that link to then employment opportunities locally. I've seen that, and then I've seen the complete opposite, where they're really under-resourced. So someone is appointed as a political appointee and has 3 different sets of responsibilities. Preparedness is only one amongst the 3. So it really varies a lot by region, and that has a lot to do with the person that's elected to govern, whether it's the mayor or the governor. They have a lot of flexibility and leeway in terms of how they utilize their resources to invest in preparedness activities. There is a nationwide level disaster preparedness fund that's made available to all local government units, but not all of them know how to effectively access and use it, which is another problem.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Masa Haraguchi. I'm a postdoc fellow with Professor Nicholas Menzi. So my question is about prior experience
Yes.
and the scientific knowledge, maybe.
Yeah.
So if I listen correctly, the people who has a prior experience have better preparedness. Is that correct?
It's not fully clear. That was one of our assumptions going into it, but that really wasn't borne out by the data, and it's not clear exactly what the pathway there is. Like, it's not obvious whether repeated exposure reduces, for example, the resources you have and therefore your ability to cope, as opposed to having previous experience means that you have know-how and knowledge about what to do that you might not have had previously, so you're better prepared. It wasn't clear from the data that previous experience was going to lead to you being much better prepared. But what was clear was, if you felt, it was this whole self-efficacy thing. So if you believed that you were responsible and you could do something to prepare for disaster, that was highly associated with people actually taking steps to do it. Whereas the people that said, like, this is in God's hands, then,
Because I assume that prior experience sometimes influence like positively, but at the same time negatively. Like if they have experienced the prior disaster, they assume that the same magnitude of that disaster will happen again, and if the future disaster exceeds that magnitude, like negatively influence.
True, that could also be happening, but there wasn't a clear kind of correlation or association there. Even though I you know, we could assume or expect that there might be. Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
I wonder if just from a research perspective, you could test some theories about sort of the recency of the salience of disasters. I think on attitudes or preparedness or belief in climate or knowledge about climate change. And I would have thought this is usually a very difficult research design, but since you mentioned this is actually a setting in which many people are exposed very frequently to
Yes.
disaster.
Yeah.
So maybe sort of spatial design or recent exposure to a typhoon, for example.
Yeah.
Changes attitudes in a way that might be persistent or not.
Yeah, no. The Philippines, from a research perspective, is like a dream because it's going to be repeated constantly. It's horrible for the society, but you do know that it's going to be hit repeatedly by these things. And so any measures that are taken to invest, you can kind of measure what the impact is, because there's enough recurrence of these issues and enough exposure that you can actually measure the impact of interventions. Yeah, but there are also so many other factors that are involved that change the dynamics that are not necessarily related just to, for example, climate change impacts, but political impacts and the administration that's in place, geopolitics. All of these things are changing the focus and relative salience of disaster preparedness. Because there's a trade-off in terms of what the focus is, and all of those things are playing a major role. Yes.
Good question. What does El Nino do in the Philippines? Make it worse or better?
That's a good question. I don't know at a sort of more granular level. I think it's had different results. It's exacerbated drought in some places, and it's changed severity of typhoons in others. But I couldn't tell you at a granular level exactly how it's impacted.
Because you're collecting data now.
We're collecting data now.
I wonder what El
Yeah.
Nino did. Okay.
Yeah. There are definitely that's an entirely answerable question, not from the data that we have, but from data that are being collected by like the Manila Observatory, or the government is collecting that data on a regular basis. And so there's certainly an answer to that
It's
question.
just because if the recent experience will bias your answer, you probably want to know what El Nino does, because it's out there.
Yeah, and there'll be so many factors. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how things have changed in terms of the actual engagement of these activities and knowledge, because so many things have happened. I mean, it's almost like a completely different.
What's your sample size?
It was like 5,400. Yeah. Nationwide.
One who raised their hand on Zoom.
Oh, okay.
It's Daniel Wickler.
Hi, I don't know if you can answer this or not, but I'm wondering how much of this this is a Filipino story. I'm thinking of a couple of things: the ignorance of climate change, and the degree to which people, the gap between what people think the governments should be doing and their perception of what they think they are doing. Is this? Do you think you'd get comparable results if you look at what would? I'm not even sure what the comparable countries would be, but I don't know whether it'd be Indonesia or whatever. But in the area, or is this? Do you think it's in the Philippines is quite different? And I'm asking, of course, because Philippines has its own unique history, and I'm wondering whether that explains some of that's sort of a deep source for some of the results you got.
No, I think that's an excellent question, Dan, and I can't answer it. I don't have enough information about other sources to make any real judgment about that, other than to say that I'd love to apply the same methods that we've used in the Philippines to other countries in the region. because they all face at least similar natural hazards, but they are very different in terms of history, culture, et cetera. But I don't know how much of it is particular to the Philippines. I suspect a considerable amount is specific to the Philippines. But I couldn't tell you exactly what. Thanks for the question, though.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more online?
No, that's it.
Well, if we have no more questions, I guess we can just please join me in thanking our speaker, and I'm sure he's got a few minutes, maybe a few minutes to chat. If there's any others
Absolutely.
who would like to chat after the talk, I know we have a few minutes left, but please join me in thanking Professor Bollettino for joining us.